Between 2015 and 2021, America's four largest freight railroads cut roughly 56,000 jobs, nearly one-third of their entire workforce, not through recession, not through automation, through a deliberate strategy that Wall Street rewarded with every quarterly earnings call. Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and Norfolk Southern, the carriers that move the backbone of the American economy, shed an entire generation of workers, and with them, decades of skill, knowledge, and institutional memory that you cannot rehire. They didn't lose these people. They engineered their exit. And when demand came roaring back, the railroads discovered the true cost of profiting yourself into a crisis no amount of efficiency can fix. Freight rail sits at the heart of the American supply chain, moving more than 40 million carloads every year. From the wheat fields of Kansas to the auto plants of Michigan, nearly every raw material, industrial input, and finished product that crosses the country spends part of its journey on a freight train. But this is not a story of countless small railroads. Four carriers, Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and Norfolk Southern, dominate the field, controlling the vast majority of freight traffic across the continental United States. Their networks stretch coast to coast. Union Pacific alone covers 23 states, while BNSF boasts more than 33,000 miles of track. CSX and Norfolk Southern knit together the industrial corridors of the East and South, linking ports, factories, and distribution centers in a web that underpins daily life. These companies are not just moving freight, they are moving the backbone of the American economy. Every decision made in a boardroom in Omaha, Fort Worth, Jacksonville, or Atlanta ripples outward to farmers waiting for fertilizer, automakers counting on just-in-time parts, and retailers stocking shelves for the holiday rush. When these railroads change how they work, cutting jobs, altering schedules, or chasing new efficiency targets, the consequences reach far beyond the tracks. A missed shipment in Chicago can idle a plant in Alabama. A bottleneck in Los Angeles can leave store shelves empty in New England. The choices made by these four carriers are not just corporate strategies. They are decisions that shape the flow of commerce, the stability of jobs, and the resilience of entire communities. When Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and Norfolk Southern decided to reinvent how they run trains, they set off a chain reaction that would test not only their own operations, but the strength of the nation's supply chain itself. The fate of these railroads is inseparable from the fate of the country's infrastructure, and the stakes, measured in livelihoods and in the steady movement of goods, could not be higher. A railroad job once meant a place in a world built on skill and trust. In towns where tracks cut through fields or hugged riverbanks, the railroad was more than an employer. It was a foundation for families, a source of steady work that offered not just wages, but a future. Workers often joined in their 20s, expecting to stay for decades. Seniority shaped every part of the job. The longer you stayed, the more control you had over shifts, assignments, and the rhythm of your life. Rules were clear and enforced by national unions. SMART TD, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, machinists, electricians. These organizations negotiated pay, overtime, and benefits, securing real medical coverage and a pension through the Railroad Retirement Board. For many, the railroad meant a middle-class life, sometimes out-earning college graduates in the same towns, especially with overtime. These were jobs people built families around. The work itself demanded hands-on skill and local knowledge. It wasn't something learned from a book, but passed down in yards and shops, from older hands to the next generation. Many workers could point to fathers, uncles, or grandparents who had worn the same uniform, worked the same line, and told the same stories. The railroad became part of a family's identity, a point of pride, a shared language. Skills were learned by doing: handling a frozen switch, diagnosing a failing air brake in the dark, reading the subtle signs of trouble before disaster struck. Safety rules, sometimes bent but never ignored, marked you as someone who belonged. Schedules were tough, nights, weekends, holidays away from home, but there was a rhythm to it. Crews could count on local runs, yard shifts, and patterns that made planning possible. The work was hard, but it made sense. Even as Wall Street's attention turned to efficiency, the railroad's core remained in the hands of skilled people, guided by memory and trust. This was the world that would soon face a profound break. Precision-scheduled railroading arrived with the promise of a sharper, leaner rail system. At its core, PSR meant fewer trains, but each one longer and more tightly scheduled than before. The old model, where trains assembled as needed, often waiting in yards for the right mix of cars, gave way to a relentless timetable. Every train had a slot. Every asset had to move. The philosophy was simple: keep everything in motion, eliminate slack, and treat every idle locomotive or crew as wasted money. This shift played out in the numbers. Median train length climbed to about 5,300 feet, with the longest 10% of trains stretching past 9,600 feet. Some runs now routinely hit 150 cars, a scale that once required two separate crews. The focus on asset turns, how quickly a locomotive or rail car could be put back to work, drove a new kind of discipline. Standby equipment, once kept on hand for breakdowns or surges, was cut to the bone. Redundant yards, especially the smaller ones that had anchored local jobs for decades, were shuttered or consolidated into sprawling hubs. Every so-called efficiency gain quietly erased a layer of backup. Where five-person crews had been the norm, engineer, conductor, brakemen, and yard staff, two-person crews became standard on most main lines. In some pilot corridors, a single engineer took the controls, with conductors reassigned to ground-based roles or eliminated entirely. The ripple effects reached deep. Fewer yard masters, fewer maintenance teams, fewer hands to diagnose trouble in the dark or improvise when things went wrong. The logic was as clear as it was ruthless. By removing every ounce of slack, PSR squeezed out costs and delivered the operating ratios Wall Street demanded. But each cut also stripped away a margin of safety, a cushion of experience, a job that once anchored a family. The railroad became a machine tuned for maximum output, leaving little room for the unpredictable, the human, or the hard-earned wisdom that had kept trains running through generations of storms and breakdowns. E. Hunter Harrison was not born into the boardroom. He started as a carman on the Frisco line, working the tools and the tracks, learning railroading from the ground up. By the early 1990s, he had risen to lead Illinois Central, and from there, his ideas would ripple across the continent. Harrison saw the railroad as a system to be tamed, a network of assets and schedules that could be made to run with the precision of a clock. Every idle locomotive, every slow-moving car, every surplus yard was, in his eyes, a liability. At Canadian National, then Canadian Pacific, and finally CSX, Harrison imposed a doctrine of relentless discipline. He wrote memos that became scripture, spelling out how trains should run on fixed schedules, how assets must always be in motion, and how excess of equipment, of workers, of time, was a threat to profitability. The old language of railroaders gave way to a new vocabulary: asset turns, velocity, operating ratio. Executives learned to speak in these terms, justifying cuts as modernization, and touting every reduction as proof of progress. Harrison's approach was as much cultural as operational. He did not just change what railroads did, he changed how they thought about themselves. Under his leadership, the pursuit of efficiency became a kind of faith, and the cost of standing still was measured in dollars lost and jobs erased. By the time Harrison arrived at CSX in 2017, the message was clear: The future belonged to those who could do more with less. For Wall Street, this was the gospel. For the railroad's workforce, it was a warning. On quarterly earnings calls, railroad executives spoke a language that Wall Street understood: operating ratio. This single number, operating expenses divided by revenue, became the scoreboard that mattered above all else. A lower operating ratio meant less spent for every dollar earned, and investors watched it like hawks. At Union Pacific, a drop from 73% in 2015 to 58% by 2022 was paraded as proof of progress. CSX boasted a 55.3% ratio in 2021, while Norfolk Southern and BNSF each pointed to their own records in analyst briefings. Every point shaved off the ratio was celebrated, not just as a technical achievement, but as a sign the railroad was transforming into a lean, modern enterprise. The internal playbook was clear: cut costs, cut assets, cut people. Headcount became a lever, not a legacy. Each round of layoffs, each closure of a yard or reduction in crew size was justified as a step toward a more efficient operation. Executives described these moves as modernization, but the logic was financial. Labor, once the backbone of the railroad, was recast as a variable expense, a line item to be trimmed in pursuit of a better ratio. On paper, the rewards were immediate. Share prices climbed, bonuses were paid, and annual reports glowed with the promise of a more competitive industry. The operating ratio became the public proof that management was delivering for shareholders. Yet behind the numbers, the reality was far more complicated. The same metric that signaled victory to Wall Street masked the erosion of skills, the loss of experience, and the disappearance of a generation of railroaders. What was celebrated in earnings calls often translated to empty lockers and silent yards across the country. The scoreboard told only part of the story, but it drove every decision that followed. The arithmetic is brutal. Between 2015 and 2021, the combined workforce of Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and Norfolk Southern shrank by nearly 56,000 jobs, a collapse of almost 40%. This was not a slow fade or a handful of isolated layoffs. Every carrier slashed headcount year after year in a deliberate, system-wide drive. Union Pacific dropped from around 47,000 employees to just over 32,000. BNSF went even further, cutting more than half its workforce from 36,000 to 14,600. CSX and Norfolk Southern each shed thousands, CSX falling from 29,000 to 20,900, Norfolk Southern from over 30,000 to 18,100. This was the cost of efficiency, measured not in percentages, but in people. The cuts hit every corner of the network: engineers, conductors, yardmasters, carmen, maintenance crews. Not a single carrier was spared, and no region was immune. The numbers tell the story of an industry that set out to become leaner and, in the process, cut through its own foundation. The timeline is relentless. In 2016, CSX dropped 2,000 jobs. By 2018, Union Pacific announced back-to-back layoffs, 750 in one round, 475 in the next. BNSF's headcount fell by more than 20,000 over 6 years, with layoffs rippling from the Midwest to the West Coast. Norfolk Southern trimmed nearly 1,000 jobs in a single year, then kept cutting. Each dip in the workforce lined up with a new operating ratio milestone, a chart climbing up for investors as the roster shrank below. And all of this happened as the work itself became harder. Trains grew longer, some now stretching past 9,600 feet, while crews shrank. Where 5 or 6 people once ran a train, now 2, and sometimes only 1, took on the same load. The old safety net of extra hands, extra eyes, and backup crews was stripped away. What looked like progress on a spreadsheet felt like extraction on the ground. The promise was efficiency, but the reality was a generation of railroaders erased in pursuit of a number. Attendance was no longer a matter of trust or common sense. In the new regime, every hour off the job became a liability, tracked and scored with the precision of a credit report. Union Pacific's point system, rolled out in early 2023, assigned a numerical value to every absence. Workers began each year with a fixed bank of points, 30 in most cases. Missing a shift for a family emergency, a sick child, or even a funeral meant losing points. Accumulate 28 points in a rolling 90-day window, and the consequences could be swift: written warnings, suspension, or the end of a career. 14 days of perfect attendance could erase some of the debt, but the system never forgot. CSX revised its own policy in January 2023, capping the limit at 60 points, with escalating discipline at 20 and 40. Points expired after a year, but any unscheduled absence, no matter the reason, counted against the total. Even when CSX softened penalties for last-minute sick calls, the underlying message held: the railroad would control not just work hours, but the very shape of workers' lives. BNSF's high-vis policy sparked open revolt. The company's on-call model required engineers and conductors to be reachable at any hour, sometimes for days at a stretch. Missing a call could cost several points, and only 2 weeks of uninterrupted work would earn a small credit back. In 2022, unions filed suit arguing that the policy violated the Railway Labor Act and forced employees to choose between their health and their jobs. Legal briefs described workers sleeping in their cars, afraid to stray too far from the terminal, never certain when the next call would come. Ordinary life events such as illness, a child's recital, or a parent's funeral became hazards to be managed, not realities to be accommodated. The new rules measured worth by availability, not by skill or years of service. Discipline itself became a tool of control, a permanent threat hanging over every shift. In this world, the railroad demanded not just labor, but the surrender of time, family, and the right to be human. The new attendance rules and relentless cuts did more than thin the ranks. They rewrote the daily reality of those who stayed, pushing the work from demanding to punishing. Conductors and engineers found themselves holding down jobs that once took 5 pairs of hands, now done by 2, or sometimes just 1. The margin for error shrank as train lengths grew and backup crews disappeared. Every absence, every late call, every family emergency became a risk to a worker's livelihood, tracked and tallied by a point system that never forgot. Fatigue was no longer a sign of personal weakness, but a structural condition built into the system. Union statements described members sleeping in their cars, afraid to go home for fear of missing a call. Testimonies gathered by the Colorado Sun and Smart TD painted a picture of crews working 20-hour stretches, sometimes back-to-back, with no guarantee of a full night's rest. One BNSF engineer wrote, "I have to choose between seeing my kids and keeping my job. The railroad owns my time." The old sense of apprenticeship, where a new hire learned from the hands who had survived winters, derailments, and breakdowns, began to vanish. With so many veterans gone, the pipeline of knowledge snapped. New workers cycled in and out, rarely staying long enough to learn the craft. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that only about 30% of new conductors remained after 2 years, a churn rate that left gaps in safety and skill impossible to fill on short notice. The loss went deeper than numbers. Pride in the work, the feeling that you belonged to something bigger, that you were trusted to keep the country's freight moving, gave way to resentment and exhaustion. Workers described a culture where mistakes were punished, time off was suspect, and loyalty counted for little. Union Pacific's own reports acknowledged a drop in morale, even as the company touted record safety and efficiency metrics to investors. The railroad's identity shifted. The old world of steady, skilled work, passed down through families, sustained by craft and memory, was replaced by a regime of constant pressure. Workers were told they were essential, but treated as expendable. What changed was not only the workload, but the dignity of the job itself. The result was a workforce stretched to its breaking point, with fewer hands carrying more weight, and the bonds of trust and pride that once held the railroad together left in tatters. In the spring of 2021, freight demand roared back to life. Factories ramped up. Ports overflowed with containers waiting for trains that never arrived. But the railroads, after years of shrinking their crews, closing yards, and treating every extra worker as a cost to be cut, were caught flat-footed. The very people who had been pushed out, laid off, or driven to quit were now desperately needed, and there was no one left to call back. Yard dwell times, once measured in hours, stretched into days. At major classification hubs, trains sat idle, waiting for crews that did not exist. The Surface Transportation Board logged complaints from shippers across the country. Grain elevators with crops piling up, auto plants missing parts, fertilizer shipments stalled for weeks. CSX admitted to hundreds of delayed or canceled trains in late 2021, citing only one reason: there simply were not enough qualified people to run them. This was not an accident, nor a fluke of the pandemic. The labor shortage was the direct result of years of deliberate decisions. Between 2015 and 2021, the four major carriers cut nearly 56,000 jobs, almost 40% of their total workforce. Each round of layoffs, each wave of forced retirements, had been justified as a step toward a leaner, more efficient railroad. But when the country needed trains to move again, the system proved brittle. There was no slack, no reserve of skilled hands, no margin for error. Hiring could not keep pace with the rebound. New recruits, rushed through training, struggled to master jobs that once took years to learn. Veteran engineers and conductors, many of whom had left under pressure or in frustration, were not coming back. The institutional memory, the knowledge of tracks, signals, and how to keep freight moving through storms and breakdowns was gone. What remained was a skeleton crew, stretched to the breaking point, trying to hold together a network that had been optimized for profit, not resilience. The irony was inescapable. The model that had promised flexibility and efficiency had delivered the opposite: a fragile system unable to respond when the stakes were highest. The railroads, in pursuit of lower operating ratios and Wall Street's approval, had hollowed out their own foundation. When the call for help finally came, there was no one left to answer. The contract fight of 2022 didn't start in a boardroom or a union hall. It broke out on the front lines. As the clock ran down on a national labor agreement covering more than 100,000 rail workers, the country braced for a crisis that could freeze the movement of everything from grain and coal to Christmas toys. The stakes were clear. Rail is not just another industry. A single day without trains would cost the economy an estimated $2 billion. For months, negotiations dragged on, with the carriers holding fast to their vision of a lean, always-on workforce, and the unions pressing for one thing above all: sick leave. For years, the railroads had insisted that their attendance systems were fair, that point-based discipline and on-call scheduling were the price of efficiency. But in the pandemic's aftermath, as COVID swept through yards and crews worked back-to-back shifts, the demand for paid sick days became the line in the sand. Workers asked for 7 days, a modest request in most industries, but anathema to carriers who had built their business model on maximum availability. The railroads countered with just one paid day, plus a patchwork of unpaid leave and complex point systems that left little room for illness or family emergencies. The standoff escalated into a national emergency. By summer, President Biden convened a presidential emergency board to mediate, a rare move reserved for disputes that threaten the nation's basic infrastructure. The board's recommendations offered modest wage gains but sidestepped the sick leave issue, leaving unions and workers furious. As the deadline loomed, talk of a strike grew louder. Shippers warned of empty store shelves and stalled factories. The White House and Congress faced mounting pressure to act. In late November, the House passed legislation to force a deal, voting 290 to 137 to impose the tentative contract and narrowly approving a separate measure to guarantee 7 paid sick days. The Senate followed, averting a strike by a margin of 80 to 15. But the sick leave provision failed, 52 to 43. The final outcome was a contract imposed by law, wage increases granted, but the central demand for paid sick leave left on the table for most workers. The 2022 showdown laid bare the cost of treating labor as endlessly flexible. For the first time in a generation, the public saw how brittle the system had become. The railroads had engineered a workforce that could be stretched but not sustained. When workers asked for the bare minimum, a handful of sick days, the answer was a national political crisis, a forced settlement, and a workforce left to wonder if anyone in power understood the reality on the ground. The contract fight was resolved, but the deeper conflict between profit and people remained unresolved, echoing through every yard and crew base across the country. The consequences of railroad staffing cuts did not stay hidden in company ledgers. They hit the real world with force, measured in missed shipments, stalled plants, and lost revenue across entire industries. In the spring and summer of 2022, a fertilizer plant in the Midwest shut down for 3 weeks. The reason was not a lack of demand or a mechanical failure, but a 48-hour delay in rail deliveries caused by crew shortages. The plant's owners reported a $12 million loss, traced directly to rail cars that sat idle, waiting for a crew that never came. Across the Great Plains, grain elevators filled to capacity as loaded cars stacked up with no one to move them. Export contracts slipped away, an $8 million loss for some operators, while crops sat in bins, unable to reach the ports. In the Southeast, an auto parts manufacturer missed a critical just-in-time delivery after a CSX train was delayed by a shortage of qualified staff. Production lines stopped. The automaker lost $5 million in downtime, all because the train that was supposed to arrive never left the yard on schedule. Retailers felt the ripple effects too. One national chain reported 2 weeks of inventory shortages after intermodal containers failed to arrive. The result was a $4 million hit to sales. These were not isolated incidents or minor inconveniences. Each case was documented in filings to the Surface Transportation Board, backed by financial statements and supply chain reports. Shippers described a system that had become unreliable, where the promise of precision was replaced by uncertainty and loss. The logic of efficiency, fewer crews, longer trains, less backup, created a new kind of waste. Instead of slack in the railroad, there was now slack everywhere else, in idle factories, in unsold goods, in contracts lost to competitors. The railroads had streamlined themselves so aggressively that when demand surged, the system broke. The cost of cutting too deep was measured not just in jobs, but in the missed opportunities and mounting losses of the industries that relied on them. What disappeared with the last wave of railroaders was not just headcount, but the living memory of how the system actually works. The old hands carried a kind of knowledge that can't be written down: how to read the rhythm of a yard, how to coax a balky switch in a January freeze, how to spot trouble on a signal board before it became a disaster. This was tacit skill, layered over decades, transferred not in classrooms, but on the job, side by side. story by story. When those workers left, by layoff, by burnout, or by retirement, the pipeline of experience snapped. Training a new conductor or engineer is not a matter of weeks or even months. Labor economists estimate that it takes 1 to 2 years for a recruit to become truly proficient, but the instructor corps itself was shrinking. BNSF's own reports showed a 10% drop in training staff after budget cuts, just as the need for mentorship was peaking. The result was a revolving door. Bureau of Labor Statistics data show only about 30% of new conductors were still on the job after 2 years. Most never stayed long enough to learn the craft, let alone pass it on. The loss is hard to measure but easy to feel. Crews who once learned routes from veterans now rely on manuals and apps. Yardcraft, the art of moving cars safely and efficiently, has become a fading language. Each departure took with it a map of local shortcuts, unwritten safety habits, and the judgment that only comes from seeing 100 things go wrong and knowing which one matters. What vanished was not just a workforce, but the memory of how to keep the railroad running when the unexpected arrives. That is why, for those who remain, the phrase "lost generation" is more than rhetoric. It is a daily reality, written in every missed connection and every lesson that cannot be taught in a classroom. Today, America's freight trains run leaner, but the scars remain. The promise of efficiency delivered record profits, yet left supply chains exposed, and a generation of skilled railroaders gone. As headlines warn of new shortages and fragile networks, one truth cuts through: you can't automate experience or replace loyalty with spreadsheets. The cost of sacrificing people for numbers is now counted in delays, risks, and futures lost. What would you have done differently? Share your thoughts below.